Hello, and welcome back to another discussion in Christian Evidences or Christian Apologetics. Today I want to do the second part of our discussion on the search for the historical Jesus. Just to remind you, we're looking basically at this 200-year period in which a scholarly task has gone on to try to find out what the real Jesus is like here. I compared it to a symphony with 4 movements, and we've looked at the first 2 movements, the first search for the historical Jesus, and then this period when there was no search going on at all, called the period of the no quest, or the period of the no search. Again, I want to emphasize the importance of knowing this particular material. You know, someone once said in Tactics Concerning War that the best strategy to defend yourself is to know what your offense is doing, to know what the enemy is up to. I don't like to think about other scholars necessarily as enemies, but I think that basic idea is a good idea. If we know what our critics are saying, what exactly claims they are making, what they're doing, and the history of why they're saying what they're saying, we're going to better be able to answer them. And so that's why I think it's important to know this particular material. So let's pick up where we left off here. At the end of the period of no search, we got to a particular point now where people were saying that there's no reason to search for the historical Jesus, that what really mattered was the Christ of faith. This third movement, our third movement here, is our second search for the historical Jesus, and it goes from 1953 really to present day here. Okay, in 1953, a theologian by the name of Ernst Käsemann gave a lecture, a paper, called "The Problem of the Historical Jesus," and in that paper he was very critical of the discontinuity between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history that the period of no quest had basically developed. His basic idea, his basic thesis was that Jesus must be rooted in some way in history, and if he's not, then the Christ of faith can be formed by the whims of any scholar. He can say anything about him that he wanted. We have to have some sort of historical foundation behind what we're saying about this particular person here. Other people agreed with him and wrote some other works basically agreeing with that particular point of view. Their basic idea was that while faith does not depend on history, a certain amount of history concerning the historical Jesus could in fact be known. And it was vital to understanding the Christian message of the kerygma that was part of the Christian message there. So the second search is really an attempt to adjust the pendulum swinging here. The period of no search swung the pendulum too far one direction into theology. The second search now wants to swing the pendulum back a little bit to give us some more history to understanding theology here a little bit. There's an interesting dichotomy here then to see between the difference between the first search and the second search. The first search wanted to show a discontinuity between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. The second search comes along and actually wants to try to unify them together here. However, it's important you know that this unified Jesus is not the Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus of the Bible, as we understand it, the Son of God who saves your sins. This unified Jesus is the Jesus of Bultmann theology, which is predominant at this particular point. A Jesus stripped completely of his divinity, basically a human person who had a basic human message about living authentically by radical decision making. So that's the Jesus that we're coming up to at this particular point here. There are 5 characteristics of this second search movement that I want to mention here, and they're important to understand, and they're still very much a part of much thinking that's going on today. The first characteristic was a concentration on the sayings and teachings of Jesus. This movement did little work concerning the actual deeds of movement. There was the deeds of Jesus, there were some things that were out there, but mostly they were about his teachings and his sayings, and that's understandable because the basic thrust of this movement is the message that Jesus was communicating about living a particular kind of life, not necessarily what he did. So there's really minimal history here is what they're trying to accomplish. The second characteristic is very important to understand, and that's the establishment of criteria for distinguishing the historical from that which is fabricated, which was made up by the early church here. Obviously, this view holds that the Gospels are a mix of history and fabrication, and so therefore we have to have some sort of way of knowing which is which. So they establish certain criteria here, and I just want to mention a few of these that I think are very important in understanding this movement. The first is what was called the criteria of double dissimilarity. What that criteria basically said, according to these scholars, was that if anything that was said by Jesus in the Gospels is something that we can find rooted either in ancient Judaism or in the early church, then it probably was not authentic. The idea is that the writers of the Gospels probably added it in from their either Jewish background or from what the early church has been teaching through the epistles of Paul. And so therefore, it probably wasn't what Jesus said here. It's called the criterion of double dissimilarity. But if it was dissimilar to anything that came from ancient Judaism or the early church, then that was a sign of probably being authentic. A second criteria was the criteria of multiple attestation. If I could find something that Jesus said in multiple independent sources, well, then that was a good chance that it was probably authentic. By independent sources, I want to make sure that we understand here that we're talking about not just simply Matthew, Mark, and Luke as independent sources, because remember, Matthew and Mark are dependent a lot upon what, Matthew and Luke, are dependent a lot upon what Mark said. Okay, we're talking independent sources here, but if I can find it in independent sources, that is probably authentic, and I can accept that as historical. A third criteria was the consistency with the accepted tone and theology that came basically from that day. Of course, this is that Bultmann theology, that basically Jesus really wasn't God, didn't claim to be God, didn't do miracles. And so therefore, anything that had that in that was automatically rejected because it was inconsistent with that basic theology. Okay. A fourth criteria was called the criteria of embarrassment. This criteria basically says that if there's something that's embarrassing to the early church and it's in the gospel accounts, it's probably authentic. It's not hard to understand why that would be considered authentic. If I want to do a cleaned up account of the Gospels, I would clean up and get rid of all the embarrassing things, the things in there that I don't want people to see that are hard to explain or difficult to understand. Therefore, if something as embarrassing is inside the Gospel, is inside my story, well, then that probably means it really happened. Okay, and that's why it's there. A fifth criteria was the criteria of Mark and priority, the idea that Mark was the earliest gospel. And that's a key thing for many of these critical scholars. If something comes from Mark, that's a good sign that it may be authentic, because Mark was earliest. Matthew, Luke, and especially John were much, much later, and therefore probably got their material or added or elaborated on a lot later. Okay, Mark being early didn't have as much elaboration on it. Now, it had some. I don't want to give you the idea that they thought that all of Mark was authentic, but at least if it came from Mark, that was a stronger argument for authenticity. Okay. The final criterion I'll mention here is that the fact that the Gospel of John simply has no real historical value at all. These critical scholars almost completely ignore the Gospel of John. The reason being is John was considered to be a very, very late gospel. It's the most theological gospel. It has the most theology about Jesus in there. And therefore, these scholars just figured most of that is elaboration, very little of actual history that's in there. It's so different from the Synoptics. So therefore, they just simply ignored John as far as having any historical value at all. Our third characteristic of the second search was the acceptance of other writings apart from the canonical Gospels as being authentic, independent sources. This is especially true of something called the Gospel of Thomas. Now, what is that? You probably never heard of the Gospel of Thomas. Well, the Gospel of Thomas is a writing that we found in the Nag Hammadi library. This was a library that was discovered in Egypt in 1945, which has a number of Christian writings in it. And there was this gospel in there called the Gospel of Thomas. It's 114 sayings. It's literally a gospel of sayings. Very little history. No resurrection, no death of Jesus. Very little about Jesus as far as having done anything. It's all just a bunch of sayings here. Okay, we call it a Coptic gospel because that's the language it was written in, the Coptic language, the language of Egypt at that particular point. And many of these critical scholars say that that gospel should be accepted as well as these other gospels. It's important to see that what they're doing here, by the way, is they're not elevating Thomas to the level of our canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're actually lowering the canonical gospels down to the level of Thomas, and they're saying they're all equal. And some have actually published a writing called the Five Gospels rather than the Four Gospels that are part of that. But that's very much considered a source to consider as well. A fourth characteristic is the acceptance of viable alternative ancient views of Jesus. This idea is that they challenge the traditional view that basically the church arrived at an orthodox view and then heresies arose around that the church had to defend the orthodox view against these heresies. That's not what these critics say really happened. What happened is that all these views of Jesus occurred at the same time, okay? And the view that won out was just simply the one that had the power behind it. You've heard the saying that history is written by the winners. Well, that's what this view basically wants to say about the Gospels. That the Gospel accounts, the Orthodox account of Jesus, was basically written by the church at Rome, which basically won over all these other alternative views. This view says, hey, those alternative views are have just as much validity as the Orthodox view we have, and we need to consider all of those views as possible views of Jesus. Finally, a fifth characteristic of the second search that I want to mention was the rise of another form of criticism called redaction criticism. Now, I've already introduced to you two criticisms. Source criticism, which deals with the literary sources pre-gospel, in other words, the Q and Mark and things that were written before the Gospels were written, okay? And form criticism, which dealt with the oral stories that were spread around during the time between Jesus' death and the time the literary Gospels were written, which according to these critical scholars are many, many years, okay? What is redaction criticism? Well, redaction criticism basically wants to look at the guys who actually put the Gospels together. Okay, now you need to understand for these critical views, these are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the apostles who followed Jesus and the people that lived immediately after Jesus and during that time. These are redactors, or redactors like an editor, that lived many, many years later, 70 to 100 years later, long after these guys have passed away and died. They took the oral stories, they took the literary sources, and they put these together into the formation of the Gospels. Their basis was their own theological presuppositions that they had that formulated these particular stories. Redaction criticism basically goes in and tries to figure out how the editor put it together this particular way, why he selected this story in this way and such like that. What was he trying to get across here? Okay, in his way of what theological position was he trying to argue here? That's called redaction criticism. That came about during this particular time of the second search here, okay? The second search peaked about the 1980s, 1990s, and it peaks with the work of a group called the Jesus Seminar, which was a group of 72 scholars that basically kind of voted on what they thought was authentic and inauthentic and wrote this work called the Five Gospels, which they call the authoritative or the scholars' version of the Gospels here. That's probably the peak of that particular period here, back in maybe the late 1980s, early 1990s here. Many historians today, though, really have become very critical of the second search here for basically two reasons. First of all, it's provided precious little information about the historical Jesus. As much as it's claimed to do that, actually they end up rejecting more information about Jesus than accepting. And the second reason, which is the more important one, is it's tied too closely to Bultmannian theology. Okay, in other words, it's predominated by a particular theological point of view here, that Jesus Christ is not God, that he didn't do miracles. We start with that presupposition. If miracles are impossible, well then of course you have to explain away all that stuff that's in the Bible. And they just start with the presupposition that miracles are impossible. They don't even try to defend that, because that's where Bultmann came from. Okay. This particular search is kind of waning today, although it's still pretty influential in many theological schools, mostly in North America here, okay? But this then leads us to our final movement, okay, our final period, okay, which is the third search for the historical Jesus. Our first movement is the first search. Our second movement is the period of no search. Our third movement is the second search. And our fourth movement is the third search for the historical Jesus. And I date that from about 1980. It's a little bit earlier, give or take. There's no set date on this particular one. Up until the present, a period of about 30 years we're talking about at this point. Now, you should know right away there's some controversy about this particular movement. Some see it as an expression of the second quest. Others see it as a separate quest altogether, okay? And some just don't even recognize this movement even exists at all. But I do. I think there's a definite, distinct movement here that we can call a third search movement here, okay? While there's no set date, this third quest began as a reaction against the second quest, okay? Again, the major point being is that theological assumptions were controlling too much of historical investigation, okay? And this movement makes a real attempt to do history apart from theological presuppositions. Now, of course, you can't get completely away from all your presuppositions. Nobody can. We all have them, okay? But they wanted to do as much real history here and not let theology dominate, which in the second search was very much the case. Bultmannian theology was dominating and making decisions of what they could and wouldn't accept long before they could even do the real historical investigations. Well, this has two results in the third search. First of all, there are many divergent theological positions represented in this particular search. You'll find evangelical scholars here, you'll find liberal scholars here, you'll find all sorts of different theological positions here. They're all historians trying to find the truth. Okay. The second thing, and I think this is very important and very good news for those of us that are orthodox or conservative, okay, is that this search is very friendly to the idea of the supernatural. They're more open to it. Now, I don't give you the idea that everybody in this search, thinks that the supernatural miracles occurred, but they're at least open to allowing the possibility that they could occur here, okay, which certainly the second search was not open to at all. Miracles are not ruled out in this search a priori before they even start here. Now, what are some major characteristics of the third search? Well, first of all, number one, an emphasis and concentration on understanding Jesus as a first century Jew. This is very important. This is very much at the heart of the third search here. The social and religious climate of Judaism becomes paramount in understanding Jesus' mission and what he was trying to accomplish. Jesus was a first century Jew who was addressing other first century Jews. And so for the third search, the idea of Judaism and what Jesus was doing for Judaism becomes paramount. Okay? The third search doesn't usually see Jesus as the start of the church, although he becomes the foundation for the church later. They see Jesus basically as talking to Jewish people about Judaism, and as being, in a sense, seeing himself as kind of the pinnacle of what Judaism is all about. A second characteristic was a rejection of the strict attachment to this criteria that we saw in the second search here, especially the criteria of double dissimilarity. Basically, the third search says there's no reason why we wouldn't expect to see in the gospel accounts some aspects of ancient Judaism or some aspects of the early church as part of those accounts. If the early church is based on the teachings of Jesus, then you would assume to see in the teachings of Jesus some things we see in the early church. Okay? The criteria they thought was valuable for confirming the information, but we shouldn't rule out history if the criteria is not met. For example, multiple attestation. It's good if something is multiply attested in the independent sources, but that doesn't mean we should rule those sources out if, in fact, we don't have them multiply attested. A third characteristic of the second search was a high view of the accuracy of the oral tradition. Okay, unlike the form criticism, which says the oral tradition distorted the story of Jesus, many third searchers believe that the oral tradition actually is very, very historical. And I'm going to talk a little about that in another lecture down the road. A fourth characteristic was a broader field of study beyond just the sayings and teachings. The third search is also interested in the deeds. What did Jesus do? That's important as well. And finally, a fifth characteristic was a view that the Gospels are genuine attempts to be historical. They're not just simply the teachings, presenting the teachings and the needs of the early church. That there's a genuine attempt here to try to find out historically, to record historically what Jesus really did here. Now, the third search, while not necessarily arguing for an inerrant or an inspired text or the divinity of Christ, you don't see that. I'm not trying to give that idea there. But you certainly see more of an open view towards that, a friendliness towards that. And many evangelicals are very much involved in that third search idea, okay? Well, where has all this gotten us today? Let me see if I can sum this up pretty quickly for you, okay? You need to realize that there is no one view of Jesus out there. There are, in fact, a plethora of views of Jesus out there. Okay, the idea that there's two views of Jesus, the liberal view and the conservative view, that's very, very simplistic. Okay, that's not what's there at all. Okay, there's a whole range that exists from the orthodox view of Jesus as the Son of God, okay, to radical views that sees Jesus as married to Mary Magdalene, for example, in the Da Vinci Code, or that Jesus traveled to India or even Japan, some people argue in some cases. Lots of different views out there. However, there are five that are prominent, and I want to finish up by just quickly mentioning the five most prominent views of Jesus that you'll see that critical scholars argue. First of all, there's a view that Jesus was basically a Jewish peasant cynic. This is the view of John Dominic Crossan, very, very important figure in the historical Jesus movement today. Okay, his basic idea was that Jesus was a social or political revolutionary who condemned oppression of the poor by the rich and the powerful, and eventually was crushed in the end by those rich and powerful people. In other words, he basically failed in the mission that he was trying to accomplish. The second view of Jesus that's very predominant is that Jesus as a wise spiritual sage. This is the view that's promoted by Marcus Borg, another important writer in this area here. This idea is that Jesus was a wise spiritual healer who had a special divine connection, but was also involved in social reform. Again, not the Son of God, okay, not necessarily a prophet, but a very wise person. He was one of those persons, says Borg, like we find throughout history, that seem to have a touch of the divine in them, okay, in some way or another. A third view of Jesus that's very predominant out there is Jesus is a Gnostic teacher. This is the view of Elaine Pagels, for example. Jesus was an early teacher of a view called Gnosticism. Now, what's Gnosticism? Well, just real quickly, Gnosticism is the idea that one can have special knowledge about God in some way or another, insight, and that salvation only comes through having this special knowledge. Gnosticism also believes that the material is evil and the spiritual is good. So your material body, for example, is evil, but your soul is what's good. That's Gnosticism, and this view says that Jesus was one of those Gnostic teachers. A fourth view that's very prevalent out there is Jesus as the Jewish prophet, or sometimes the marginalized Jew, depending upon who you read here. For John P. Meyer, for example, Jesus was a marginalized Jew who attempted to live the real Jewish life, okay, in opposition to the Jewish culture of the day, which was not the real Jewish life that they were supposed to live. N.T. Wright sees Jesus who saw himself as the Messiah. Now be careful here. For Wright, Messiah doesn't mean God. Messiah means deliverer. Okay, and he saw himself that particular way, a first-century Jew who believed that the kingdom was coming through his own work. Finally, of course, we have Jesus as the Son of God, the Orthodox view here. Jesus was the second person of the Trinity who came as a fulfillment of God's promises, taught us how to live righteously and lovingly, performed miracles to authenticate that message, was crucified and died on behalf for our sins, and rose again to show that he had conquered death. That's the Jesus of Orthodoxy. That's the Jesus that I want to defend in our further lectures as we talk about this issue of Christian evidences. Thank you.